June 18, 1945, 1400 hours, Lake Susupe perimeter, Saipan. The tropical heat was a physical weight, pressing the smell of diesel fumes and rotting jungle vegetation deep into Hana Shimizu's lungs. Rain lashed against the corrugated tin of the supply depot, turning the red earth into a slurping, treacherous mud. Beside her, 40 women huddled under leaking ponchos, their eyes fixed on the roar of the engines. 50 yards away, a monstrous bathtub-shaped vehicle, a GMC DUKW-353, revved its engine, the distinct whine of its six-cylinder engine cutting through the storm. It was ugly, hulking, and absurd. "They are mad," whispered Emmy, gripping Hana's arm. "The bridge is gone. There is no road." The American driver, a corporal chewing gum with infuriating calm, didn't turn the wheel. He drove the six-wheeled steel beast straight off the muddy bank and into the churning brown floodwaters of Lake Susupe. Hana gasped, bracing for the inevitable sinking, the screams of drowning men. "They are killing themselves," she shouted in Japanese, her hand flying to her mouth. But the truck didn't sink. It groaned, leveled out, and then, impossibly, began to churn forward against the current, a propeller kicking up a white wake behind it. If you enjoy deep dives into history, please subscribe and comment where you're watching from. 3 weeks earlier, Camp Susupe internment sector, Camp Susupe, Saipan, late May 1945. The mud of Saipan was not like the soil of home. It was red, volcanic, and possessed a sticky malice that tried to pull the Zori sandals off Hana Shimizu's feet with every step. "Keep the line straight," Hana murmured in Japanese, her voice low. She adjusted the brim of her woven hat, shielding her eyes from the glare of the Pacific sun. Behind her, 12 women shuffled forward. They were a ragged patchwork of civilian blouses and repurposed military drab, their faces thin but set with a hard porcelain resolve. They were the cleaning detail, a euphemism for the grunt work the Americans didn't want to waste their own men on. To their left, beyond the barbed wire, the American war machine was screaming. It was a cacophony that never slept. Bulldozers, massive yellow beetles, tore down palm groves. Jeeps buzzed like angry hornets. But today, the Guard, a young MP with a sunburned nose and an M1 carbine slung lazily over his shoulder, marched them toward a new sector, the quartermaster testing grounds. "Move it along," the MP grunted, gesturing with a lit cigarette. They entered a clearing near the edge of Lake Susupe. Here, the noise of construction faded, replaced by the idle thrum of idling engines. Hana looked up and stopped. Her breath caught in her throat, not from fear, but from confusion. Parked in rows along the muddy bank were the ugliest vehicles she had ever seen. They looked like the bastard offspring of a boat and a truck. They had the 6 heavy, treaded wheels of the standard American GMC trucks that hauled artillery, but the chassis was enclosed in a bizarre bathtub-like steel hull. A pointed nose jutted out the front, and, most absurd of all, a bundle of rope and a life preserver were strapped to the side of the metal cabin. "What are those?" whispered Emmy, a young girl who had been a typist before the invasion. Hana narrowed her eyes. She saw a propeller shaft tucked high under the rear bumper, looking fragile and exposed. "Toys," Hana said, her tone dripping with the disdain she used as armor. "The Americans are so rich they build trucks that pretend to be boats. Look at them. Too heavy to float, too wide for the jungle trails." She watched a mechanic in greasy dungarees hit the side of one hull with a wrench. It rang with a hollow, tinny sound. "It is a waste of steel," Hana stated, loud enough for the women to hear. "While our men fight with spirit and bayonets, the enemy plays with bathtub cars." She felt a flicker of pride. This strange, ungainly machine was proof of what the officers had always said. The Americans were soft. They needed comfort. They needed gadgets because they lacked the will to walk through the mud. The MP blew his whistle, cutting through her thoughts. "All right, ladies, net repair. Over there." He pointed to a pile of cargo nets stacked near the strange vehicles. Hana bowed her head in mock obedience, hiding a smirk. She walked toward the iron bathtubs, confident that she was looking at a monument to American stupidity. The smell of manila hemp was pungent, clinging to Hana's fingers as she knotted the frayed edges of the cargo nets. It was monotonous work, but it allowed her eyes to wander. 5 yards away, the American mechanic, a shirtless giant with grease smeared across his chest, was shouting at the driver inside the lead vehicle. "Drop 'em down to 10. Sand settings." Hana didn't understand the English words, but she understood machinery. She watched, expecting the driver to jump out with an air hose or a pump. That was how it worked in the Imperial Army. Maintenance was sweat and labor. Instead, the driver simply reached for a lever on the dashboard. Hana paused, a knot half-tied in her hands. A sharp hiss, like a serpent exhaling, cut through the humid air. Before her eyes, the massive rubber tires of the six-wheeled beast began to sag. The sidewalls bulged outward, increasing their surface area on the soft mud. She blinked, looking for the hidden hose. There was none. "Lazy," she whispered to herself, though a cold prickle of confusion ran down her spine. They can change the air in the tires without leaving the seat? It seemed excessively fragile, a system that complex, airlines running through rotating axles, was destined to break in the field. It lacked the brutal simplicity of the Emperor's Type 97 trucks. To Hana, it was another sign of American decadence. They invented machines to avoid the simple dignity of getting one's boots muddy. She shifted her gaze to the rear of the vehicle. A three-bladed propeller was housed in a recessed tunnel, protected by a steel cage. It looked small, almost toy-like compared to the bulk of the chassis. "It tries to do too much," Emmy murmured from beside her, following Hana's gaze. "A truck that wants to swim, a boat that wants to drive. It will do neither well." Hana nodded, feeling reassured. "It is a chimera, a monster of parts." The mechanic slapped the steel hull. "All right, pump 'em back up. We got weather incoming." Again, the hiss and the tires miraculously inflated, rising back to their hard, road-ready shape. The display of technology was undeniable, but Hana chose to see it as a parlor trick. Let them play with their inflating tires. When the real rain came, when the mud turned to soup, gimmicks would fail. Only grit would survive. Above the tree line of Mount Tapachau, the sky had bruised a deep, angry purple. The wind suddenly shifted, carrying the heavy electric scent of ozone and impending violence. The storm did not arrive. It assaulted them. By nightfall, the sky over Saipan had collapsed. Rain fell not in drops, but in solid sheets, driven horizontal by a gale that screamed through the guy wires of the internment tents. Inside Section C, the world was reduced to leaking canvas and rising water. Hana stood ankle-deep in sludge, her shoulder jammed against the center pole of their shelter, fighting to keep it upright. Around her, women were bailing water with tin cups, their movements frantic and futile. "It's coming through the seams," someone cried out. "Keep bailing," Hana ordered, though her voice was swallowed by the roar of the wind. For 12 hours, the deluge battered the camp. The red earth, so sticky the day before, dissolved into a brown torrent that flowed like a wound through the center of the compound. When the gray, watery dawn finally broke, the rain slackened to a drizzle. But the camp was a wreck. Wet bedding lay in heaps. The air smelled of sewage and despair. Hana stepped out into the mud, shivering. A group of internees had gathered near the main gate, where a muddy jeep had just skidded to a halt. An American lieutenant was shouting at the MP in charge of the sector, his gestures angry and sharp. Hana moved closer, feigning the task of wringing out a blanket. "Gone!" the lieutenant shouted, wiping rain from his face. "The trestle bridge at Chalankanoa is gone. Washed out completely. We can't get the deuce and a halfs across." The MP looked toward the prisoner compound. "Sir, today is rice distribution. We're out." "You think I don't know that?" the officer snapped. "The engineering corps says 24 hours to rig a new span. Until then, nobody crosses the river. Not us, not them." Hana felt a cold stone settle in her stomach, heavier than the hunger already gnawing at her ribs. The Americans had K-rations, wax-sealed boxes of meat and biscuits she had seen them eat. They carried their food on their backs. But the prisoners? They relied on the daily truck from the southern depot, a truck that needed a road that needed a bridge. She looked at the swollen, churning brown water of the creek that separated the camp from the main supply lines. It was no longer a creek, it was a barrier of death. "So," she whispered to herself, "their machines are useless without their roads." It was a grim vindication. The Americans were paralyzed by the mud. But as the sickly cough of a child drifted from the tent behind her, Hana realized the price of this victory would be paid by her own people. By noon, the rain had stopped, but the silence it left behind was worse. It was the silence of a camp holding its breath. In the infirmary tent, Hana stared into the bottom of the rice bucket. It was empty. The white dust at the bottom mocked her. "Is that all?" Mrs. Tanaka asked from her cot, her voice thin and reedy. "The trucks cannot cross, Tanaka-san," Hana said softly, wiping a damp cloth across the older woman's forehead. "The river has taken the bridge." "Then we will die," Tanaka whispered, closing her eyes. "The Americans will feed themselves first. It is the way of war." Hana tightened her jaw. She wanted to argue, but the logic was sound. She knew the Geneva Convention articles. She had heard the Americans boast about them. But paper laws dissolved in mud. If the supply lines were cut, the captors would eat K-rations, and the captives would eat air. She walked out to the perimeter fence. The mud sucked at her boots with a hungry sound. Across the wire, the American guards looked miserable, huddled in ponchos, eating cold beans from cans. Even they were cut off. A megaphone crackled to life from the main watchtower. "Attention! Food distribution will commence in 10 minutes. Form a line at the west gate." Hana frowned. Lies, she thought, to keep us calm. The west gate opened directly onto the flooded bank of Lake Susupe. There was no road there anymore, only a churning expanse of brown water, swollen and violent, carrying uprooted palm trees toward the sea. No truck could drive through that. No boat could navigate the debris without capsizing. "They are mocking us," she muttered to Emmy, who had lined up with her aluminum bowl. "There is no food coming." "But look," Emmy pointed. On the far side of the flooded expanse, half a mile away, a line of dark shapes emerged from the tree line. They were the iron bathtubs, the DUKWs. Hana let out a short, bitter laugh. "The toys," she said. "They're going to drive those heavy clowns into the water? In this current?" She felt a strange mix of pity and scorn. The Americans were desperate. They trusted their machines too much. She watched the lead vehicle approach the ragged edge where the road disappeared into the floodwaters. It didn't slow down. "Watch," Hana said, her voice hard. "Watch them sink." Hundreds of women pressed against the chicken wire fence, their fingers hooking into the mesh. Silence descended over the camp, heavy and thick, broken only by the rushing sound of the swollen river. Across the water, the lead DUKW idled at the very lip of the eroded bank. It looked even more ridiculous from this distance. The olive-drab paint was caked in mud, and the white Allied star on its door was barely visible. It sat high on its 6 wheels, a lumbering beast of burden that had no business near a flood. "They are waiting for boats," a woman behind Hana whispered. "Surely they are waiting for boats to ferry the cargo." "There are no boats," Hana said, her eyes fixed on the driver. He was a young man, wearing a helmet liner but no steel pot. What caught Hana's eye was the bulky yellow vest he wore over his fatigues. She had seen pilots wear them. The Americans called them Mae Wests, a vulgar joke about their shape when inflated. Why wear a life vest in a truck? The question hung in her mind, uncomfortable and sharp. The driver stood up in the open cab. He didn't look like a man about to die. He looked bored. He checked the straps of his vest, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud, and then looked back at the column of vehicles behind him. He raised his arm, a simple, circular motion. Winded up. "He is insane," Emmy breathed, gripping Hana's sleeve. "Look at the water. It is moving too fast. Even a sampan would capsize." Hana felt a strange tightness in her chest. She wanted them to fail. She wanted the river to swallow that arrogant machine to prove that steel could not conquer the elements. But another part of her, the nurse who had seen too much death, held her breath. The engine of the lead DUKW roared, a deep, throaty bellow that echoed off the jungle canopy. The driver sat down, gripping the large, horizontal steering wheel. He didn't inch forward cautiously. He accelerated. The truck lurched over the muddy lip of the bank, its nose dipping sharply toward the brown, churning violence of the flood. "Banzai," Hana whispered, the irony bitter on her tongue. The splash was catastrophic. The DUKW hit the brown water not with the grace of a hull, but with the blunt force of a brick. A wall of muddy spray erupted, obscuring the vehicle entirely. "It's gone!" a woman screamed. For a terrifying second, Hana thought she was right. The heavy steel nose of the truck plowed deep under the surface, burying the hood and the driver in the flood. The current grabbed the rectangular body, twisting it sideways. Gravity, Hana thought, her knuckles white on the fence. Iron sinks. It is the law. But then, with a groan of displaced water, the nose heaved upward. The green hood broke the surface, shedding gallons of river water like a surfacing whale. The roar of the engine changed pitch, a deeper, laboring grind. Hana saw the driver's hand fly to a lever between the seats. He wasn't steering the wheels anymore. Suddenly, a jet of water shot out from the side of the hull, arching high into the air. "It's leaking!" Emmy cried. "Look, water is pouring out!" "No," Hana corrected, her eyes widening. She realized what it was. It's pumping itself out. It was a bilge pump, a machine designed to bleed while it fought. At the rear of the truck, the water began to boil white. The propeller had engaged. The 6 wheels were still spinning, churning the water uselessly, but the screw bit into the current. The clumsy rectangular box shuddered and then, impossibly, began to move forward. It fought the lateral push of the flood. The driver wrestled the steering wheel, correcting his course with the rudder. The vehicle was no longer a truck. It was a barge, powered by a GMC engine, carrying 5,000 pounds of cargo, as if gravity were merely a suggestion. Hana watched the wake spread out behind it, forming a V-shape that cut through the chaos of the storm-ravaged river. Her mouth felt dry. The Americans hadn't built a bridge. They had brought a machine that didn't need one. The sheer arrogance of it made her dizzy. They didn't adapt to nature. They engineered nature into irrelevance. The DUKW was now halfway across, bobbing rhythmically, aiming straight for the mud bank where Hana stood. The sound changed again. As the DUKW approached the muddy incline of the prisoner's side, the churning splash of the propeller was joined by the grinding whine of gears. Hana stood paralyzed. The beast was 10 yards away. She could see the rivets on the steel hull. She could see the driver's focused expression as he fought the steering wheel to keep the nose pointed at the slot in the fence. It cannot climb, she told herself desperately. It is too heavy. The bank is too slick. But the Americans had thought of that too. As the front wheels struck the submerged mud bank, they didn't spin helplessly. Thanks to the deflated tires, soft and wide like the feet of a gecko, they gripped the slime. With a lurch that shook the ground, the 6-ton Leviathan hauled itself out of the river. Water cascaded from its wheel wells. Weeds and debris hung from the axles. But it climbed. It drove up the slope with a relentless, mechanical grunt, transitioning from a boat back into a truck in the span of a heartbeat. It rolled past the stunned MP at the gate and came to a halt right in front of the gathering of women. The engine cut. The silence that followed was louder than the storm. Hana stared at the cargo bay. It was not empty. Stacked high, covered by a heavy canvas tarp that the driver now threw back, were sacks, dozens of them. White cotton sacks stamped with blue American lettering, U.S. Gov, rice, short grain. The cognitive dissonance hit Hana like a physical blow. She felt dizzy. Her government had told her the Americans were weak. Yet here was a machine that defied the land and the sea to bring rice to the enemy. It wasn't the firepower that broke her heart in that moment. It was the logistics. It was the terrifying realization that they had built a truck specifically to solve the problem of a river, just as they had built planes to solve the problem of distance. They didn't stop, Emmy whispered, tears mixing with the rain on her face. They drove through the flood for us. Not for us, Hana corrected, her voice trembling, because they can. Because for them, the impossible is just a delivery schedule. The driver hopped out of the cab. He didn't look like a samurai or a demon. He looked like a tired boy from Ohio. He adjusted his life vest, looked at the stunned women, and gestured to the sacks. "Chow time," he said. The line moved quickly. There was no shoving, only the reverent silence of hungry people receiving salvation. Hana held her aluminum bowl with both hands when the scoop of boiled rice landed in it, steaming, sticky, incredibly white. The smell almost brought her to her knees. It didn't smell like war. It smelled like home. She walked away from the cook tent, not toward the barracks, but toward the wire where the DUKW still sat. The driver was gone, likely smoking with the MPs, but the machine remained. Steam drifted lazily from its engine vents. The green paint was scratched, revealing the bright steel beneath, and coils of river weed still clung to the propeller guard like medals of a strange campaign. Hana extended a hand. She hesitated, then pressed her palm against the flat, ugly fender. It was warm. It vibrated slightly, like a living thing catching its breath. "It is just a truck, Hana," Emmy said softly, appearing beside her with her own bowl of rice. "Don't look at it like that." "No," Hana murmured, her eyes tracing the white stencil on the bumper. Next to it was the insignia of the Quartermaster Corps. An eagle perched on a wheel, crossed by a sword and a key. The sword and the key, she thought. We worshipped the sword. They mastered the key. She looked at the bowl in her hands. The Japanese spirit, Yamato-damashii, taught that will could overcome matter. That suffering was a purity. But looking at the 6-wheeled amphibian that had just erased a river from the map, she realized the terrifying truth. Spirit could not drive through a flood. Spirit could not inflate tires from a dashboard. Spirit could not feed 400 women when the bridges fell. "We never stood a chance," Hana whispered, the admission tasting sharper than the salt in the rice. "Not because they are better warriors, but because they don't have to be." She took a bite of the American rice. It was soft, perfectly cooked, and warm. It filled the hollow ache in her stomach, and with it, The last of her anger dissolved, leaving only a quiet, heavy respect. From the riverbank, the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the mud. The DUKW sat silent, its deep treaded tracks leading out of the water and into the heart of the camp, a road where there had been none.